Thank you. Thank you all your members and especially Malcolm for reaching out to me and a very short talk where I just say what Curtis said. Thank you. Because that's literally how much I agree with the views. I've been thinking about multiple things that came up in the Q&A in this talk. If you read my abstract, I actually proposed what Kyle suggested, the credit economy idea. But I didn't have time to flesh it out, so I apologize. You won't be hearing about it in this talk, but I'm very much thinking about it. Trying to incorporate it. For both of Andrea's questions, this is long and hard, and hopefully and also Bruno's question about, chemistry. I have a concrete example. I'm hoping to touch on that. Okay, so let's see. So the motivating problem for me is justifying stance choice. So basically, the volunteer was biased about how to justify one's choice of stance going beyond one's own values. That is justified in a way that would appeal to holders of other stances. There have been proposals for justifying stance choice on the basis of something other than one's own values, that is the pragmatic benefits of stances. For example, feeling that you have when you feel like, wow, someone thinks exactly the way I do. But also, oh, wait a minute, I don't have anything left to say. That's how I felt when I first read this paper. Came across it a little late. It came out in 2017. I came across it maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. And then when I saw Sandy's paper, it got even more like that. But I did go on to say some things, and this was a paper that I published years ago. So specifically, I've argued for stance pluralism based on stance-transcendent benefits. Briefly, the idea is that rather than rigidly committing to a single stance, we'd be open to hopping across stances based on their pragmatic benefits. So in this talk, I first want to unpack this idea a little more. Then try to address some nagging questions that have arisen in response, specifically about the causal link between a stance and its apparent payoffs. And whether any such payoffs can truly be stance-transcendent in the sense of appealing to holders of other stances. I'll just very briefly say something about Bauman. Sandy mentioned Bauman in his talk yesterday. Like he said, Bauman says, if the irrational, the stance volunteer is irrational for not having epistemic reasons for choosing an epistemic stance. And he says this is kind of more paradoxical. I don't think it's more paradoxical because what would be obviously more paradoxical is if you said, I'm adopting an epistemic stance, but I don't have reasons to think that it is epistemic. But that's not what's going on here. That's all I'll say now because I don't have time. But I'd like to argue that although so I disagree with Bauman that it's a problem to not have epistemic reasons to adopt an epistemic stance. But I would like to argue that although we don't need epistemic reasons for adopting a stance to be deemed rational, it would be nice to be able to present some reasons other than personal values so that a stance holder can appeal to holders of multiple stances. And this reason, the stance pragmatist, and I count myself as one, says can be the benefits of a given stance. And benefits not just for those holding the stance, but for others too. So-called stance-transcendent. And an ideal consequence of this, I think, is what I call active stance pluralism. In my earlier work on this topic, I proposed a range of attitudes one can take along the monism-pluralism spectrum towards stances. So these are the range of attitudes. So you can be a stance monist in principle and in practice, where you say, basically you're being anti-voluntarist. So Fincock is anti-voluntarist in that he thinks we're rationally obligated to be realists. Survell thinks the opposite, that we're rationally obligated to be empiricists. So they are anti-voluntarists. We are monists, both in principle and in practice. You could be stance pluralist in principle, but stance monist in practice, accepting of other stances solely as a consequence of voluntarist rationality. And I call this in my paper token pluralism, where you're saying, like Van Trussen, right? So he's saying, yes, multiple stances are rational, but I am an empiricist. So in practice, like Van Trussen does not adopt multiple stances. He himself is an empiricist. So that's what I call token pluralism, or stance pluralism in principle, but monist in practice. So yeah, and then you can be a stance pluralist in principle and stance monist in practice, but wholly appreciative of other stances for their contextual benefits. So the second one I call, never mind. This one I call weak active pluralism, where you're not accepting other stances only begrudgingly because, it's just natural consequence of modernism, but you're saying, yes, this is great. I'm glad that you're taking this stance, even though I'm not taking it for maybe practical constraints or whatever. And then you can be a stance pluralist in principle and in practice, and this is what I call strong active pluralism, where you yourself are actively taking on multiple stances. So my order of preference would be, it's right there, and enter here. So my order of preference would be 4-1. I will for 4 to the extent possible, but I would also happily take 3. Interestingly, as it turns out, it seems that 3 and 4 are sort of anti-voluntarist too. And I'll get to that in the last part of the talk. Before going further, I think it's important to clarify 4 distinct but arguably related kinds of stances that have been often lumped together. Maybe I should comment, maybe I should not, for the fact that a lot of my talks don't have typology applications. I take my work as offering conceptual clarification. So this is one typology, and now I'm going to talk about another regarding types of stances that have often been lumped together. There's scientific stances internal to science, like the more technical stances. And then there are philosophical stances in the service of scientific practice. And then there are stances about science held by philosophers. And then there are global epistemic stances that with extended. So let me now give examples of each of the above and discuss what pluralism look like. So I'm going to focus more on the first two. I don't think I want to get into the third and fourth, and I also don't have that much to say about the third and fourth, so I'll focus more on this. So scientific stances. So Chang, and his name has come up a number of times here, looks at phlogiston and oxygen each as part of a system of practice, and that's his term, as opposed to the traditional idea of a collection of propositions. So for Chang, the system of practice is a coherent cluster of epistemic activities, aims, values, and rules. As a coherent whole, this cluster is meant to successfully satisfy the aims within it. Among other aims, the phlogistonist system was characterized by the aim of explaining key properties of materials in terms of their constituent principles or fundamental substance. Chang called this approach principlism, and consequently, phlogistionists were preoccupied with activities of classifying substances according to observable properties, explaining the properties of substances by reference to principles, and effecting transformations of substances by the application of withdrawal principles. And the oxygenist system, on the other hand, while it did share some aims with the phlogistonist system, rejected the aim of explanation in terms of constitution. It was rather characterized by questions regarding heat and changes of state. Each camp values different epistemic values. The oxygenists adhere to the philosophy of what Chang calls compositionism, according to which chemical substances are to be viewed in terms of elements or compounds composed of elements. Consequently, chemical reactions were explained as the rearrangement of stable building blocks. Quite clearly, you see where I'm going with this. I think Chang's system of practice closely resembles stance. It's a scientific stance. Chang contends that the central reason for the wide adoption of the oxygenist system and the rejection of the phlogistonist system was due to the gradual ascendance of compositionism over principalism. which was a matter of preference and convention rather than any hardcore, rational or evidential factors. And Chan shows that the phlogistonous system had several stance-transcendent benefits to offer, and if allowed to survive, would have probably accelerated scientific progress. This is some counterfactual history is engaging in, and there has been some criticism of it, but I'm very sympathetic to that approach. For example, phlogiston was closely related to the modern idea of metals having free electrons. And so he said that could have possibly accelerated the discovery of the photoelectric effect. I'll just leave you with that one example. He gives, many more. And obviously, from the modern perspective, the oxygen stance has huge benefits as well. One of the most obvious being that of simple and elegant practice of balancing weights on either side of chemical reaction. And Chang also discusses, sort of supporting my view of pluralism. Chang also discusses the advantages we could have, or we could have had, if the two systems had coexisted and interacted with each other. For instance, he asks, how would Lavoisier have done what he did if Priestley hadn't made oxygen and showed him how to do it, and if Cavendish hadn't made water from hydrogen and oxygen and let Blackman tell Lavoisier about it. Chang, has calls for a pluralistic approach where both ideas are entertained simultaneously and given their due. Other examples of scientific stances would be punctuationism and gradualism, as discussed by Sandy here in biology, and also Jamie Elder's work on the inflationary multiverse theory, or rather, she sees it as a stance in cosmology. So now let's go up one level. I'm still going to stick with scientific practice, but now let's look at overtly philosophical stances taken in the service of scientific activities. And here again, more psychology, more classification. I identified three kinds of philosophical stance deployment in scientific practice. So one is philosophical stances guiding the choice of scientific activities. And then the second would be philosophical stances guiding the specific scientific topics. And then philosophical stances guiding overall attitude towards practice. So let's look at the first one. Philosophical stances guiding choice of scientific activities. Basically the examples that Forbes presents in his work, where he discusses Weber, Maxwell, and Helmholtz, and they have different philosophical stances that guide their scientific work. So I won't get into details here, but briefly, the idea that specific philosophical stances adopted by scientists seem to lead them to pursue and succeed at specific things. And of course, like he said, more work is needed. This is maybe a little bit speculative. But I think that there is definitely something to that. So, for example, Weber was a committed realist, and his work was rooted in the ontology of charged electrical particles, such as precise measurements of various parameters of those particles. And Maxwell, on the other hand, was explicitly an instrumentalist in his proposals of mechanical models of ether. I mean, he got really creative, right? Cogs and fields and all sorts of things. And Helmholtz was an empiricist engaged in producing novel phenomena. So here are some stance-transcendent benefits, just some quotes from Forbes' paper. I'm not going to read everything, but basically it's talking about how the benefits produced by one stance are very much appreciated by holders of other stances. So like Weber's work was very much useful for Helmholtz and Maxwell and so on, right? So there's that cross-pollination. So while I initially thought I was pushing for a slightly stronger normative account than Curtis was, while he argues that circumstances can be good for certain individuals, occupying certain or being in certain situations or circumstances, I propose loosely that all individuals pursue, or at least enthusiastically encourage, all stances with benefits that they appreciate. Of course, within the constraints of practical, within practical constraints. How great would it be if a single scientist engaged in all these different kinds of, projects while being guided by development stance in each situation? So that is the essence of my strong /weak active stance pluralism, but after yesterday's lunch, I'm thinking maybe we're more on the same page, and yeah, I don't know if there is a significant difference here. So anyway, so for now same category, but another type. This subtype of philosophical stance is guiding attitudes towards specific scientific causes. There's numerous examples, but I'll discuss the case of orbitals in physics and chemistry as presented by Sharon Krasnow. I just love this paper. So very briefly, following Eric Serra, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name, the philosopher and chemist. Some notes that according to quantum mechanics, it is problematic to assign electrons to orbitals in multi-electron systems. That is anything going beyond hydrogen atoms. And hence, strictly speaking, quantum physics is incompatible with the idea of orbit. This turns out to be a mathematical result. It's mathematically prohibited. But orbitals are fundamental to chemistry. Chemistry orbitals are reified to such a great extent. They're reified to such a great extent in, say, talking about covalent bonds in organic molecules, that while working with them, while working in chemistry, asking a chemist if they're a realist or an instrumentalist about orbitals is a distraction. Chemists talk about orbitals as though they were robustly real. Okay, now after the responses to our parts talk today ago, like that sort of response, I know better than to claim simpliciter that chemists are taking a realist stance while practicing chemistry or while working with orbitals. Although initially I was very sympathetic to working. But I think there's something philosophically very juicy about cases like this. But I've struggled to put my finger on what exactly the stance is here. But this is what I now think. So I think we should distinguish between more classification. I think we should distinguish between three levels of stances. First, the stance or attitude that informs the unreflective working scientist. They're just doing their science. They're not really thinking about anything meta at all, just first order stuff, first order business. So that sort of unreflective stance would be a realist stance to be distinguished from, to Anjan's point, it's not really realism, but, for lack of a better term, they act as though orbitals are real, and that's all there is to it. It's not philosophical in any deeper sense. So that would be a naive realism, right? That's not philosophical sense. But next, we can think of a reflective philosophical stance informing working chemists, right? So imagine a chemist who is well aware of the quantum mechanical result about orbitals, that it's mathematically prohibited and all of that, and doesn't even disagree with it, right, regarding the ontology. Imagine she's also read some philosophy of science and generally has a philosophical bent of mind. At the same time, she's a committed chemist, right? And this is not too made up. For example, this happens all the time, right? She's a committed chemist. If you ask her what the philosophical stance that informs her work in chemistry is, that is when she's wearing the chemist hat, it would probably be the equationist, where she's saying, orbitals are what chemistry tells us they are. And that's it. Now, if you pull her out of the arena of chemistry, right, and make her wear a brighter, shinier philosophy hat, and ask her what she really thinks about the ontological status of orbitals, and now she'll probably say, take an instrumentalist stance. And this is when she'll get into the business of addressing ontological questions, and maybe, she'll probably deny that orbitals are the sort of things that we should take as real. And arguably, the deflationary stance is important to effective work. If on a daily basis you're bogged down by ontological questions, you're not going to be able to do effective scientific work. I want to share a little, autobiographical piece here. So when I was doing my master's in physics, diagnosed why I sort of sarcastic. Well, because I should take personal responsibility, but I'm going to put a little bit of it on my professors who had this unreflected attitude, right? They were like, shut up and calculate. Don't ask questions. I wish that, if I had been helped to take on a principled deflationary stance, saying, hey, look, this is why you shouldn't ask questions about outcomes, right? It's a philosophical stance, not an unreflective stance. I might not have suffered as much. Again, some counterfactual history, your personal history here, but I like to think that because it serves my purposes. So stance-transcendent benefits of the deflationary stance, again, so much to be said about orbitals, helps you predict and design new molecules. And I don't need to get into the stance-transcendent benefits of quantum mechanics. So what does an active pluralism look like here? The strong version would say pursue both regular chemistry and quantum physics, switch between the two. Hop from the deflationary stance to the instrumentalist stance. But the weaker version would say, particularly a note to physicists, don't be condescending towards chemists. And don't tell them that they're working with fictitious stuff. Okay, so now let's get to the third subtype here. Philosophical stances guiding overall attitudes towards practicing science. Famously discussed by Arthur Fine, Einstein took a metaphysical realist position, but Fine argues that he also expressed a position quite similar to constructive empiricism in other moments. So he says, when Einstein, here, the quote, I'm done quoting Fine here. So when Einstein attaches the concept of truth to the theory, what he means is just that what the theory says about all the observable features of the world will be confirmed. And in what sense was he a realist then? He did, after all, make explicit claims about being a realist. So Fine painstakingly shows, based on various writings of Einstein, specifically his letters to Maurice Solving, that Einstein was not a realist in the sense of being committed to some underlying ontology. He did not embrace the doctrine of realism. Rather, for him, realism was a motivational force, which you brought up earlier. I think it was a motivational force that drove him to do science. In Fine's words, this realist stance was a way of being, which again is similar to the stance. Einstein found positivist science to be very uninspiring. So, interestingly, Duhem, and this is where my interest in this topic started. That's a big part of my PhD dissertation was on Duhem. Duhem had similar, but not quite the same ideas. He was explicitly instrumentalist about the theoretic classification of experimental laws in physics. He famously said that it was a mistake. He famously argued that physics and metaphysics should come apart. And he thought that the classification of empirical laws are not truths apt. They could only be convenient or inconvenient. But he also expressed an overtly realist attitude towards some of these classifications and believed that there was an underlying natural classification of laws that we were tending to, that the classifications of physics were tending to. So similar to Einstein, for Duhem, this was not a logically or rationally reasoned out doctrine, but rather a guiding stance that gave meaning to the activity of constructing physical theory. And the aim of physical theory is to construct, to come up with the classifications of experimental laws. There are many examples of benefits of the kind of unification project that Duhem was engaged in, like the empirical successes of quantum mechanics, for instance, predictive success, and so on. So we're talking stance-transcendent. So again, what would pluralism look like here? Again, engage in both empiricist or instrumentalist-inspired science and metaphysics-inspired science. So I don't have time to get into these other two categories of stances that much, but I'll just make some very brief remarks. So within philosophy of science, philosophical positions, particularly those in the realism debates, that is positions about interpreting the outputs of science, have largely, as Arjun noted, have been doctrines and not stances. Realism, for instance, can be viewed as a stance if it forms a larger framework and practical epistemic guide. We saw some instances of this in the previous category. But in this realm, where you're just a philosopher of science, you're not engaged in scientific practice, right? In that realm, it's hard to construe realism and anti-realism as stances, since I think the question, what is an anti-realist or realist stance good for the philosopher, is hard to answer. I mean, there have been some proposals. I mean, Fine says something like NOA might be the wrong account of science, but it's helpful if you want your philosophy to line up with scientific practice and all of that. So there have been some like some comments like that, but arguably this is harder, right, to discern pragmatic benefits compared to the previous categories. So I do offer some preliminary responses to this in my paper, but I won't get into it here. This problem is even more so with global epistemological stances like empiricism and metaphysics, because what you're interested in, the primary area of interest is, like you said, intellectual. It's not overtly pragmatic. You could argue that intellectual is a subtype of pragmatic. Everything is pragmatic, but you see what I mean, hopefully. So in my paper, I try to show, I'm done to work, how the metaphysics and empirical stances shape and inform and constrain each other. My overall motivation for advocating a pluralism regarding stances, in this context, is very much along the lines of, Bruno's collective or non-adversarial epistemology. Really like his idea of productive tension, at least, seriously and genuinely attempting to occupy rival stances helps us sharpen our influence. So in that minimal sense, there's stance-transcendent. I don't know if anyone here would say that only these two categories are true stance, or maybe only this one are true stances and the previous ones are not. I don't know if it comes up in Q&A, I'll say I have some things to say about that, but I'll skip that for now. Okay, nearing the end. Okay, so fundamental to my plea for stance-transcendent benefits-based stance pluralism is the idea that a stance should, first of all, offer benefits going beyond itself. Van Trussen has a similar take on metaphysics. It says, it has nothing to offer going beyond its own perspective. But here's a clarification. Should distinguish between a stance holder's own reasons for holding a stance and reasons a stance holder can give to others to persuade them about the stance. And sometimes they could line up, sometimes they could come apart. One could take a stance primarily based on their own values, right? But if the stance cannot boast of any stance-transcendent benefits, then the stance holder might not be able to sell it to others. But if it can, then that could form the basis of adopting the stance for those others, right? This distinction comes out quite clearly in the case of Einstein. For himself, the basis of taking a realist stance was motivational and was deeply personal. Right? But the stance arguably resulted in stance-transcendent benefits. So we're able to make a case for taking a realist stance in the service of scientific activity to someone even if they don't find it motivating. If this is still an unconvincing, you should at least be a weak stance pluralist, I think, in saying, okay, realism makes you an amazing physicist. So I'm so happy that you are a realist, right? So at least that's like a weak pluralism I think follows. All right. So coming to one of John's questions. So can the benefits of stances be truly stance-transcendent? We both have been in class have raised this in slightly different ways as in conversation. I should clarify that when I say transcendent, I mean transcending one given stance and not all possible stances. I mean, it's impossible to transcend all possible stances, right? So I'm not talking about a stance that has benefits from a view from everywhere, or which is essentially a view from nowhere, but rather I'm talking about, benefits from anywhere, that's a term, from multiple perspectives, multiple stances. And as the cases I've discussed and exemplify, I hope, or have the potential to exemplify based on further historical research or whatever, RCTs or whatever, I hope the products of the stance often have appeal going beyond that stance. And the last thing I want to, last but one thing I want to talk about is etiology, right, of stance-transcendent benefits. It has been sometimes objected, I thought of this myself after my paper came out, and I was like, oh, it's sort of, biting my tongue and saying I should have said something about it, and London raised this as well later. So the objection is that what reason do we have to believe that apparently stance-transcendent benefits are caused by the stances? Is there a necessary causal link? So Fine on Einstein says this, right? That Einstein's motivational realism was a way of life actually produced confirmed theories and hence knowledge was appropriately considered by Einstein to be a miracle concerning what he wrote. Concerning which he wrote to Salvi the following. The curious thing is that we must be content with circumscribing the miracle without having any legitimate way to approach it. So this, I think, very much is in line with what Anjan said. So I concede that the argument that scientists in general should be realists, since realism generally results in good scientific work, is vacuous. But the argument I'm advancing is more specific, right? So there are specific activities associated with the realist stance that have historically, or at least seemingly, yielded specific stance-transcendent benefits, right? So Forbes, for example, Weber, for example, constructing fundamental explanatory theories and empirical investigations in search of theoretical particles, right, are, for instance, uniquely realist endeavors, right? So, and in the case of Einstein, while the link between his realism and his general epistemic success is mysterious, I think there is a causal link between his realism and the kind of projects that he undertook. So the same for Duhem. But in the case of scientific stances, right, it's way more clear, way more obvious, the causal link. Of course, compositionism is going to result in very specific activities. There's a clear causal link, and arguably for other scientific stances as well. And for empiricism and metaphysics, the global stances also, I think there's something to be said that there is a causal link that we can that here. And very lastly, sorry, I'm overloading time here. It's not too big of a problem since I did the last talk, but I don't think you should much longer. Why is it a problem at all if you're not able to justify your stance to holders of other stances? Like, why bother? Right? What's the problem? Now, this is basically not a problem for the voluntarist. The Van Trossenian voluntarist says, well, I know my stance and you have yours. What's the problem? Why should I go out of my way to take on other stances? So, well, it's time to bite the bullet and concede that I see it as a problem from the vantage point of my stance, my meta stance. So pluralism is a meta stance or meta stance. I'm losing track of the number of meta
stance.
Yeah. So I keep hitting enter. Okay. So your scientific theories, the sub doctrines. So this is Van Trossenian, Chakravartian, voluntarism. I put the superscript M to indicate meta. So I'm being voluntarist about being pluralist. And I'm also not too happy to admit this, but it's okay. I'm being honest about being pluralist. Sort of. So voluntarism all the way, stances all the way. But let me just end with some, I promise this is the last bit here. What characteristics? So I'm putting these on the table, right? And requesting you to consider them. That's the voluntarist part of my pluralism. And I'm saying, look, here are the benefits of being a pluralist, right? Here are the values. Don't be too bullheaded about your values. Be open to hopping across stances. Broader notion of epistemic stance. What counts as an epistemic stance? Cognitive flexibility. To that point, I want to bring up briefly a point that Chang makes. He compares hopping between scientific theories to multilingualism, and I think that's a really nice metaphor. You're able to switch between languages. So that cognitive flexibility, I think, is an inherent, intrinsic good, that I don't think needs further argument. Eagerness to reach across the aisle. So these are some benefits of the pluralist meta or meta stance. Thank you.